You're listening to the Cantina Cast, your home for thought-provoking Star Wars talk. Join Albert and Jonesy in breaking down the latest news, trailers, movies, and of course, your favorite characters from a galaxy far, far away.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Cantina Cast. My name is Albert Padilla, and this is episode 510, where tonight we are going to answer, or hopefully attempt to answer the age-old question of what order should I watch the Star Wars movies in? And already in the chat, we've got questions about, are we just talking about movies? Are we going to wax in some, or weave in, I should say, some of the television series as well? And I think the answer is yes to all of that and more. And to help me do that, of course, is none other than Jonesy. Jonesy, welcome to the show. How are you doing tonight?
I am doing well. I'm excited to do this. This is another really fun show because, quite honestly, when people find out that you're a Star Wars fan, one of the first questions they come out to you is like either what's your opinion about whatever's going on right at that moment, or haven't really watched them. Like, what order, if I were to get into it, like what order should I watch them? And so it's a question that I think we all get at some point. Some of us probably more often than others, but it's a lot of fun to be able to debate this because there's several schools of thought that we'll walk through tonight about what the right way to do it is. And I think, long story short, there's not a right way. It's just kind of what do you want to get out of it. So I'm really excited to see where this goes tonight.
Very cool. Hey, so before we get started, though, why don't we give a shout out to some of our dedicated supporters.
Absolutely. Yeah. Special thanks to our now part of the tribe members, Rob, Mike, Lauren, Dante, Risk, Justin, Jackson, Sharkman, Dan, Daz, Isabella, Uncle Leon, Josh, Jacob, Steve, Reader Reborn, and of course our amazing Delusions of Grandeur members, Rod, CJ, and Alex. If you are curious about Patreon, and really, why wouldn't you? Because we have a lot of amazing content over there. CantinaCast.com/Patreon. You'll learn all about it. We've got a tier for everybody. If you like audio only, we've got audio only tiers. If you want access to video feeds and the other stuff, the video recordings, we've got things for that. If you want to try to come onto the show, which we've got some exciting Factboy stuff coming up. I'm about to post in the Patreon channels as well.
Right.
So all the stuff leading up to Ahsoka. So you guys will want to check that out. CantinaCast.com/Patreon. If you are listening to this, though, and this is our main general release show, we also do a live stream, CantinaCast.com/YouTube. And you could be one of these amazing people who are in our live stream chatting with us, already sharing questions and their thoughts. Jonathan Music Train, JJ Skywalker, Sky, Skywalker's Academy, and Riley. So far, we see you folks out in the background. Please do be sure to say hi. As we go through the show, let us know your thoughts, whether you agree, disagree, and we'll try to get them up on screen as well. You're on mute.
Hey,
and that's live television for you.
Live television. So thanks everybody for being here on the live stream, and so we're gonna get into all of this here. So why don't we just kind of kick this off, and let me give you quickly the origin of it. So it's funny. So like you said, this is a question that comes up almost indefinite. I mean, every time somebody brings up Star Wars for the first time with you, this is a question that tends to pop up, and I think we're getting to the point now where, because Star Wars has expanded as much as it has, there are people that are, believe it or not, coming into the fandom who have never seen the movies or have a very loose relationship at best with the movies. They may be interested and maybe coming into the fandom because of things like The Mandalorian, maybe Ahsoka, right? Some of the stuff that Disney Plus has been pushing. And so this question, I think, is going to continue to come up. And as more movies come in, I think that viewing order and what's relevant, which is probably the most important thing here, what's relevant to that viewer is going to change, is going to evolve over time. The reason this started, we were kind of tossing around some show topics, and a really dear good friend of mine, Riley, who's in the chat with us tonight, she's the one who's actually never seen, and I don't want to put her on the spot, but she's actually only seen the original. I think she saw Star Wars originally once when she was a kid and had never seen the movies since then. And so she had asked me, hey, what order should I watch these movies in? I thought, you know what, this is like, we've talked about it enough on the show, but we've never dedicated the time to kind of talk through all the different viewing orders and things. So I prescribed something for her, and she's actually been going through the course of watching all of these movies, and I don't even know where she's at this point. I told her, try to get them done before tonight's movie or episode because I didn't want to spoil anything. So
what is with you always assigning homework to people?
Well, it's just what I do. It's, people have work that's got to get done, and unfortunately it pays the bills. So So that's kind of how this started, and it's actually turned into a really. I mean, there's a lot of really fun talking points in all of this, but I guess let me start with you, Jonesy. Is there a right order for you personally, and what would that order be?
I think the answer is no. Well, if we're talking about me personally, I have my preferred order of what I tend to do this the way that I grew up with them, the way that they came out. Especially if we're talking about the movies, especially the saga movies. I will typically go, 4 through 6, 1, 2, 3, and then 7, 8, 9, and finish them up. But like you with Riley, like I had my supervisor at work ask me this question too because he wanted to introduce Star Wars to his kids and wanted to get them into it, and it started a conversation amongst the guys at work. And
Right.
it's for everyone, it's a little bit different. And I had to really think about it though. For someone, let's just say 10 years old these days, and we've talked a lot about this, like what kids expect in a movie these days is very different than what you and I grew up with, and what the prequel kids grew up with, and what they're getting with now with more of the saga trilogy and that style of movie making. So it's very challenging to try to figure out what works best. But I think I will usually default back to here's how they were released, so you can kind of go through the journey with us if you want to experience it that way. But there are definitely arguments for the other ways. But that's kind of my preferred, just because that's the way I grew up with it. And when you want to work in, Rogue One and Solo Star Wars story, I think you have some wiggle room with those, because I actually thought a lot. I thought a lot more about like Solo in particular, where I would slam it in with any of this stuff if I were to slot it somewhere between. And I was kind of surprised where I decided to kind of where I thought it would go if I had to put it in a place rather than just watching it after the fact. It's just kind of like, oh, here's some extra content for you.
Yeah. And I'm with you. I think my probably preferred order, and this is probably true, I would say this is probably true of most people. It probably does fall more in line with how we watched and experienced Star Wars to begin with. That'd be a really good question to kind of pose to the folks that came in with the prequels. I know a lot of parents kind of shoved the original trilogy in their face at a young age and said you have to watch these first, and because that's how I did, that kind of thing. But
Right.
I'm sure there is a subset of probably 20 somethings, 30 somethings that came into Phantom Menace and the prequel trilogy as their first entry, and I would be curious to find out if that's exactly how they watch them. Do they watch them in chronological order? There's a lot, and there's a lot to be said about the big reveal at the end of Empire Strikes Back and how much that
Right.
gets kind of spoiled with some of these different viewing orders and that sort of thing. But I thought what we could do to kind of start off here is I want to bring up this article that came out in 2015. So this is right around the time that The Force Awakens was releasing. And this is by Vulture, which is a subset of the New York Times, or New Yorker, I think, or whatever it is. But
Right.
they had asked the question of like, hey, how do you watch the order of Star Wars movies? And they've got a number of people in here. You can see some of the faces here where they've asked. Some of these people were very relevant and big at the time back in 2015. Probably still true. Like Aaron Paul is in there from Breaking Bad, Dennis Quaid. And I would say largely most of the people that were polled for this article said that the original order, the release order, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, was the preferred order. And that would make sense. It probably lines up generationally speaking for most of the people
Right.
that are listed here. And for the same reasons we talked about, that's exactly how they experience it. But the one that was the most interesting was George Lucas, of all people. And if I could scroll down here, you had Bobby Moynihan here, Mark Ruffalo as well. So George Lucas, though. So there were some folks that said 1, 2, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And George says, start with 1. That's the way to do it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's the way they're supposed to be done. Just because it took a long time to film doesn't mean you don't do it in order.
Right.
And I think this is probably self-serving in some way, because if you think about it, the original 6 movies really told the story of Anakin Skywalker. From my perspective, it was always about Luke. And even watching the prequel trilogies, I always figured Luke has always been kind of my focus, right? The center of the Skywalker saga. Even though I know it's not technically about him, it is about Anakin Skywalker, and of course Lucas is right in that regard. But it is self-serving for him to say that, because I think he was trying to tell that story, beginning to end, of Anakin Skywalker, the rise and fall of Anakin Skywalker. And of course, we'll get into the sequel trilogy in a little bit here, because I think that kind of throws things off just a little bit. But are you surprised that he would recommend 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 when the real avant-garde at the time, perception of these movies was that, holy crap, the title, the crawl is rolling and it's starting with episode 4. I mean, this really kind of turned a lot of folks on their head in terms of what to expect in a movie experience coming in the middle of something like that. So any surprises here?
No, it's exactly what I would expect George Lucas to say because that's his intent. He wouldn't have called it episode 1 if it was supposed to be episode 7, and then in
Yeah.
his frame of mind, that's exactly what he was telling. And I think for him, it really is the story of Anakin Skywalker. And that's why he wanted to stop at 6. When there was talk about the sequel trilogy and who would do it, for him, it really was just these 6 movies because it's Anakin's journey from start to finish. Luke is, of course, a key element of that. His prodigy, sorry, I had my phone going off. What's left of the Skywalker line and what it takes to bring him back. And this is what this family was always meant most to Anakin's for him to bring that back with Luke. At the end of Return of the Jedi, of course, that's the pinnacle. That's the true climax as far as George is concerned. And so, no, I think this is not surprising. This was his vision of the story. And why else would he start it with 1 if he didn't intend you to go watch it from the beginning with episode 1? He didn't really intend it to be a prequel. He just knew some of the things he wanted to do weren't necessarily possible at the time.
Yeah. And a quick question, just to kind of step aside from this very quickly. There was, as I was kind of poking around and seeing where other people have said over the course of, I don't know, the better part now of 40 plus years in terms of how to watch these movies, I think there is still a subset of group of people that feel like, hey, the original trilogy, unmodified, the non-special editions should factor in some way. I don't even know that that's even relevant anymore. I think most people our age have just gotten past that and don't even, I mean, as much as it's cool and very nostalgic to watch the originals, I think I've gotten past all of the special edition stuff. And it's just, to me, those are the original ones. And they're the ones that Lucas wanted. So why wouldn't we honor those? But do you think there's an argument to be made that somehow there should be a list that incorporates the original, untainted, unenhanced versions that Lucas
Right.
put out in 97?
No, not at all. I think when you look at those films, I think from a comparison and historical aspect, they're interesting. But when you look at the quality and how far they had degraded and some of that, now if you're talking about the Laserdisc, really pure, pristine copy of it, maybe there's a bit of an argument there. But when you look at most of what everybody had in their collections, they were not in great shape. They were wearing out. They were really showing their datedness. And even though some of the effects haven't weathered the storm so well of time, they still look generally better. And the cleanup work that they did was important to do. So when you look at the Blu-ray or kind of the definitive versions you'd find on Disney Plus or something right now, I think those are the versions. I mean, they are what they are. They're probably not going to change anymore, hopefully, over time, whether they kind of blur this line a little bit more. But I think when you go back and you look at some of the original ones and some of the effects have been cleaned up a little bit, I think it's just worth it to kind of bring them, keep them up to date in some way. So I'm one of those people. I'm perfectly happy with the special editions that we have, because that was also I think even for an original trilogy kid like me or like you, the special editions have a special place because that was the reintroduction of Star Wars into the world, right? We talked a lot about that. So that they're really important to us in a different way, even though maybe there's some elements that we wish we would have maybe dialed it back on or maybe trimmed a little bit more in here and there over time. But whatever. I think those are the versions. Those are the versions that George wanted. And especially if you're going to be a 1 through 6 purist, then the sequel trilogy or the special edition rather are your movies. Those have to be your 4, 5, 6. I think if you're going to go from that respect, because all of those were in the same era now, from when they were redone and when they were all published. So they're kind of in that same time period now.
Yeah, I would agree. You're honoring the maker, so to speak, in choosing those versus the original ones. Like I said, they're fun to watch. It's fun to watch the original ones, and there's something very nostalgic about it. But at the end of the day, for me, it's going to be the special editions as well. Now, the interesting thing about this article is, again, back in 2015 when this was written, there are more people on here. There's the traditional views 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, et cetera, et cetera. But then there was this version here, which we're going to talk about. It's one of the versions we've got listed, which is this machete version. And I forget the person who came up with that or coined the phrase. Maybe somebody's got it in here. But this is sort of like it. You can see. I don't know if you can see this, but the order is 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 6, and the machete, as far as I know, doesn't include number 1. And we'll get into the reason why 1 isn't included. But it is kind of a weird, almost unorthodox viewing. It is the most unorthodox viewing order that I think that is out there. I think you'll find different variations of all of the other ones, and there's slight things like adding in Solo, adding in Rogue One, mixing in other TV series. But this machete order really does kind of turn everything on its head because it removes Episode 1 completely altogether. And of course, at the time that this was written, we didn't have a 7, 8, or 9. I think the more updated version of the machete order is including 7, 8, 9 at the end of 6. But there is something, again, some pros and cons, and I know some folks have already chimed in here in the chat as well. But I guess the real quick question is, how do you feel, or have you had a chance, have you ever watched this order? And without getting into the specifics, I guess, how would you, is this something that you would even like recommend to somebody?
If you were wanting just the core story, because I think even the Machete does not include the sequel trilogy at all, right? It basically ends right at Return of the Jedi. It's just these 5 movies. And I think in some respects, it makes sense if you just want to get to the core of the story. You want to go for, Empire, and you get the reveal of, I'm sorry, you go A New Hope, introduce everybody, then you get Empire, you get the big reveal. And then you want to go back and you want to explore, the Band-Aid's been ripped off, even though maybe it's not confirmed. But then you go back to, Attack of the Clones, and you start to learn more about who Anakin was, and you bring that aspect of the story. And then the final conflict with Obi-Wan, and then you resolve everything. So I think there's a certain element that seems okay, I guess. To me, it doesn't really accomplish, I think, what maybe people are expecting it to accomplish. Like, if you still don't, the debate whenever Empire came out and we were waiting for a Jedi was Vader lying? Is it the truth? Is this really reality for what's going on, right? And the dialogue in Return of the Jedi talks very much about that. Luke asking Yoda, is Darth Vader my father? He needs that confirmation, right? Even though he's somewhat accepted at the end of Empire, it doesn't necessarily confirm a lot of that stuff. And when you get to Revenge of the Sith, it 100% confirms it. And basically you're confirming it throughout episode 2 as well. But, the exclusion of episode 1, I think we probably talked about this. It's kind of a standalone anyway, right? It just kind of remains on its own. It's a self-contained film in many ways about which direction you can go and everything else. So that one, I can understand them maybe excluding that. Now, the reasons they're excluding it are probably more, silly than anything else. But I could see if you just want to get to the core story and slim this thing down from 9 down to just what do you really need to know? These are the 5 I think that are the most impactful of the entire Skywalker saga at the very least.
Yeah. So and then let's talk about now the different orders, and I guess one thing, and maybe when we get to it, I do want to. I know some folks are already asking. I've seen a few folks already asking in the chat here about whether or not we're talking about the saga movies. Are we going to talk about Rogue One, Solo? I think the answer is yes. I've got a couple of different variations in here. I've got a little quick presentation that I made so that we can kind of follow through. So let's start with the first one, and I haven't had a chance to even see if this thing's going to work. So here we go. So this is the watch order. We're doing this thing like right on the fly. All right, so let's talk about this one first. This is the theatrical release order. It's the one we've been talking about. This is how you and I have watched the movies, with the exception of Solo and Rogue One. So table those for a second, because we will come back to those in just a minute. But I think for anybody that wanted to just kind of focus in on that, I guess the true Skywalker saga, about that, right? This is what Kathleen Kennedy was talking about back in 2017 or whenever it was. This is the tale of Anakin Skywalker and some of the, I guess the touch points to that, because this is where I'll just quickly talk about the sequel trilogy. When you look at the first 6 movies, that is beginning to end about Anakin Skywalker. When we get to the sequel trilogy, yes, there are touch points, and yes, there are probably dotted lines that kind of fall back into some of the main characters and themes and that sort of thing, but it does feel like that is more focused on the dyad, and we didn't really even get to that point. At least for me, I wasn't even able to rationalize what the sequel trilogy was until we got to the Rise of Skywalker to talk about the dyad, but it feels like it is primarily focused on Rey Skywalker, Kylo Ren, the dyad that is, and then of course you can mix it in Palpatine, but everything kind of starts with that. So it does feel like it's its own kind of separate story that's still connected, and I think they've tried to put a bow on this thing. And I the Skywalker saga was probably the most logical title name that they could give this thing to kind of, encompass and holistically capture what all of these movies were about. But it almost feels like there are kind of 2 different stories that are just, tangibly connected in some way. But
yeah,
I think thoughts, I guess, on this order first.
I think this one is, I view this one, if you're a fan of Luke, and if Luke is your Jedi, he's your Skywalker, I think this is the order for you, because when you look at the original trilogy, it's very Luke-oriented. It's about Luke's journey. And then we get into the prodigy of Luke Skywalker with the prequels, right? So what where he came from, what Anakin's story was, what are the things that contributed to all of these types of activities. And then when we get to the sequel trilogy, we had the legacy of Luke Skywalker, and I guess you could argue that the original trilogy is kind of the legacy of Anakin in certain ways too. But then you get to the legacy of Luke Skywalker. What's all the effects of his reign, if you will, from the original trilogy that are now coming back, many, many years later. And so I view it more of like the story of Luke when you look at the theatrical release order, because it's all kind of framed up a little bit in that respect, even though clearly the prequels are very Anakin focused. But to me, you could fit in your head narratively that this is very much around Luke, and where does Luke come from, and what does his legacy look like? But you lead it off with Luke of here's Luke Skywalker, here's his family, and then we just expand upon it everywhere else.
Yeah, I like that, and it doesn't. I get what you're saying too, and some people could say, well, it doesn't. When you get to when you get to the Force Awakens, there's no Luke except for the last 30 or what is it, 30 seconds or whatever it is. But at the same time, again,
Right.
it's about the legacy, though. It's like you said, right? It's like what's happened after that. And that's where I feel like it's not truly about Anakin Skywalker. And again, we won't get into the reasons why or the decisions by Disney to kind of break away from that. I think in a perfect world of a lot of people, these sequel trilogy movies were going to be focused around Luke Skywalker and truly the legacy of Anakin Skywalker through Luke Skywalker. And that didn't turn out to be the case, right? But it's still part of the Skywalker saga, especially. It almost feels like her name at the very end was probably a way to kind of shoehorn everything to make sure that there was no question that there was a way, whether you like it or not, to tie this into the Skywalker saga. But again, another topic for another day.
Okay, so do we want to try to throw Rogue One and Solo into each of these release orders as you bring them up, or do you have them worked out later on?
Surprised that you. So yeah, let me see. Hey, look at that.
Oh,
So
man.
what I'm calling this is the theatrical plus release order, and the plus to mean, or I guess represent the Disney era of movies more than anything else. And so the way I would, and again, this is some of the stuff is Jonesy's hasn't even seen some of these slides. So this is my take on how I would work these into what I would expect or what I would call the theatrical release. Officially, this is the theatrical release. Like if you,
Right.
after Force Awakens, we got Rogue One, which seems really kind of weird because you're going way back to the events of the very first movie that was ever released. And then you've got Solo, a Star Wars story that fits in between Last Jedi, Rise of Skywalker, has absolutely no freaking bearing on either one of those or even the sequel trilogy, but yet that's just how it released. So I don't know. Once you work these two in, I don't know that I would keep these in theatrical release order, honestly. I mean, I'm listing them here as such, but I would put Rogue One probably even before A New Hope, and Solo, a Star Wars story, I would probably table that and say, after you've gotten through all of this, maybe that's kind of an optional movie that you could go watch. Or how do you feel? Would you work it into, a prior prequel to A New Hope?
No, I don't think I would. I think I would put Rogue One and Solo: A Star Wars Story at the very end. They're the follow up movies you go back and revisit if you want to know more about the characters. I mean, they're kind of positioned that way anyway. They're not really intended to be worked into the entire narrative. Rogue One probably has a better argument for being in the
Yes.
actual narrative because it does tie right up to A New Hope.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think in the theatrical release you definitely don't want to start off with a Rogue One because that doesn't really work either. I think the way that they introduce the Empire and everything in A New Hope is really special in many ways, right? Just the opening shot.
Yeah.
But I think in the theatrical release, I think you almost pull these two out. They're on the side. You watch them and kind of whatever one is more interesting to you from them, from the storyline. But I think you just stick to theatrical Star Wars saga, like Skywalker saga, and these two don't play into it in this one. I think there are other ones where they do fit in quite nicely, but for theatrical release, I don't think they fit very well.
Yeah, I can see that. I saw some folks too saying like maybe you move Rogue One after Revenge of the Sith, just to kind of be that. It probably either lines up more with after Revenge of the Sith or before A New Hope, of course.
Yeah.
We'll get into the chronological order where I think it really fits in, and we'll talk more on that here in just a second.
Right.
I guess the pros and cons of this, like I don't like who would you even recommend the theatrical release to at some point? I think one of the pros is you do get that big element of surprise. If someone has never truly seen Star Wars or even heard about the big spoiler alert, as Anakin Skywalker being the father of Luke Skywalker, aka Darth Vader, if that's a big surprise to you, to me that still feels pretty special. And I don't know that that's always one of the tricky parts about recommending the chronological order versus the theatrical release, because you do lose that element of surprise. Everything does kind of get spoiled in some regard. And I don't know, it's just there's something special about that. But I guess maybe if you had somebody that was really wanting to kind of go through that original experience and wasn't under the age of 13, maybe this is the order. I don't know.
Right.
Who would you recommend this to?
I'd actually recommend this to most people, I think, because most people want to know the story of Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader. That's kind of what they're in it for at the beginning. Like, that's what they know of Star Wars. Like, if you ask anybody off the street, hey, name a character from Star Wars, it's probably Darth Vader, it's probably Luke Skywalker. And so most people want to understand those parts of the stories and see if they're even invested or interested yet, and then go through the rest of it. And so I think from that respect, it's usually the one that I would recommend to people is saying, this is how we experienced it. So if you'd like to kind of go through how everybody else did it, very cool. But if you're very much I want to know from the very beginning how everything started and how everything worked and go that way, then you start getting into the episodic chronological order of things where you actually start from episode 1.
Mm-hmm.
And that one starts to make a lot more sense than this one. But this is usually my default way of saying, hey, just go watch A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi and just see what you think. Go from there. And then if you want to continue, cool. If not, you could say, hey, I've watched Star Wars. And if you mention I know Star Wars, usually those are the 3 that people are most inclined to think about anyway. Even today with all of the other subsequent material we've got.
Okay, so here's the chronological order, or AKA the George Lucas order. And this is, again, does not include Solo, does not include Rogue One. I have that in just a second. But I mean, this is the one that we've already talked about. And you're right. Like, this is probably the most true narrative form, really kind of understanding, getting to see, the Jedi at the very beginning about where they were, the fall of the Jedi. How do we get to what we get to in the events of episode 4 and beyond? I don't know that it really benefits. I was trying to think, does this really enforce or enhance the sequel trilogy in a way? I don't think so personally. There's a couple things here and there that are nice little Easter eggs, and kind of understanding the origin maybe helps a little bit. Maybe it doesn't. The Palpatine aspect of all of this really certainly plays into this, I think, because you really get to see, it starts with Palpatine, it ends with Palpatine. He's probably the through line in all of these movies when you watch them in chronological order. But I guess, what do you think about what do you think about this order here? I think we've already talked about it, but any other thoughts here on this one?
Well, no, I think you're hitting on the nail on the head with some of the pros. I think, one, when you look at Palpatine's involvement here, it's much more streamlined and much more straightforward, and it's much easier to follow because that's where we end up with Rise of Skywalker. And from that respect, it really does feel like a Palpatine type of storyline in some respects.
Mm-hmm.
I think the other thing that really serves well with this as well is when you go from Return of the Jedi to the sequel trilogy, you have all the same characters, right? So you've still got Han and Leia, that you understand why they matter. You're not jumping back and forth. Yes, you've already been introduced them in the theatrical order, but in this one, it's very much a continuation of that storyline. And when you have the jump, you don't have to go back and kind of re-remember everything that you saw, from 6 hours ago worth of movies from, skipping the prequel trilogy. So
Yeah.
I think from that respect, this way makes a lot of sense because you are following the characters from start to finish. I think there's 2 kind of cons to it. One is the eras of filmmaking, which really have very little to do with the story itself, but just the eras of filmmaking are very jarring. And to go back in time for the original trilogy and then zoom all the way to the most recent one is pretty jarring for some people. Not everybody will have that experience, but some people will. And then I think the other part is some of the inconsistencies of the stories and some of the character arcs, that changed a little bit, especially with the prequel. They're a little more obvious, I think, when you view them this way, the discontinuity with some of it. And again, it's really, really minor. It's kind of nitpicky, but those types of things I think come out a little bit more here. Whereas when you watch the original trilogy and then you jump back to the prequels, you're like, well, you can kind of argue it a little bit better because you clearly see that they're going back and retelling an origin type of story. Whereas this one, you're trying to tell it from the very beginning, even though there's different styles of doing it. But this one makes a lot of sense for a lot of people, especially if they want to follow the characters all the way from beginning to end. And especially when you get to the sequel trilogy, the gap doesn't feel as large, I think, in some ways.
Yeah. You brought up a good point. I don't know that I don't have this in my notes, honestly. So I'm just kind of talking off the cuff here, but the filming experience, the special effects, right? I think there might be something to be said that if you watch these in theatrical release, you go in knowing that I'm watching a movie from 1977.
Right.
And so you probably have a little bit more leniency there. It's a little bit more forgiving. You're probably a little bit more forgiving in terms of the special effects, the pacing as well, right?
Right.
Whereas opposed to, that's probably an easier transition to go back and go, okay, now I'm fast forwarding, 17 years or 16 years now to 1999 with the Phantom Menace, and so I should expect things, and things do look cleaner. There's a lot of green screen, a lot of special effects. The thing was filmed in digital, right? We can get in all the technological advancements that they made for the filming of that movie. Whereas if you do watch them in this order, you do have a setback. Now that said, we'll get into Rogue One because I think Rogue One did a really good job of still, being the most recent of most of these movies, and yet still adhering to the aesthetic of the 70s that we saw in New Hope and to some extent The Empire Strikes Back. So it isn't as jarring, right, to be able to watch that where you're going from all these great special effects and then we get to A New Hope, which again, no disrespect, but it was a different time, and we were working with a lot of models and props and practical effects as opposed to the CG stuff that we got from the Phantom Menace and the prequel trilogy.
Yeah, and Rob had a good point in the chat. He says that he thinks Vader loses that fear factor when you do it this way. You just feel sorry for him. I think there's a certain element of that too. Does Vader feel as menacing in the original trilogy when you do the chronological order? And I think the answer is probably no. That we've humanized him a lot by that point.
Yep.
Rather than going back and saying, well, here's why he is. You're just kind of telling people, here's his story beginning to finish or start to finish, right? So I think in that respect, I think Rob's definitely got something there that you do lose a little bit for Vader. I don't think it's too much, but I think it definitely is a very different spin than when you see him in A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back first.
It takes the edge off him a little bit. Not a lot, but a little bit more. You certainly feel for the guy, and you can certainly understand him more than we did when we watched the original, because he was just a bad guy until we get to Return of the Jedi, right? Until he has that one moment where he comes back to the light. Up until then, he was a menace. He was scary. He was the antagonist of the film. So I think you're right. I think you do lose something from that and watching him in chronological order. Just want to quickly touch on some of the other comments. Skywalker's Academy, which I think is Dale. I think he renamed his account. He says, the reason George started with A New Hope really makes things relatable. That's why I prefer to start watching that one than any other way.
Good point.
And Riley says, chronological helped my ADHD brain remember what the heck was happening. So I think there's something to be said about that. It is very linear in that regard. And so there's not a big weight to carry from jumping around with the different timelines and that sort of thing. So that all makes sense here. Okay, so...
all right, so when you put Rogue One and you put Solo into this order, how does that work?
Yeah, I mean, I just put them, again, in chronological order. So you would leave with Revenge of the Sith, go into a Solo Star Wars story, which kind of takes away from the bridging of A New Hope in some ways, right? Because I think if you remove Solo, a Star Wars story, and you just watch, this is Mike Rondo's favorite. He was talking about this little mini arc that he used to like. He would always say he loves watching Revenge of the Sith, Rogue One, and then A New Hope. In that order, just those three movies. And he's right. There is something to be said there. There's kind of a nice little small packet of Star Wars storytelling that happens. And that bridge, that cornerstone, the bridge of that really is Rogue One. So Solo, a Star Wars story, I don't know. Maybe you move it after Rogue One, so that way it transitions a little bit easier. No, I don't know. That ruins the ending of Rogue One that transitions into A New Hope. So I don't know where you would stick that.
Yeah, I think Solo, a Star Wars story is the odd man out in this one. Now there are orders that I think Solo, a Star Wars story works really well. I just think this is just one that it doesn't, because it's such a very different film compared to what we have. But Rogue One before A New Hope, I mean, is there really anywhere else it can go? Realistically, it leads right into A New Hope, so it has to. And I think in the chronological order, I think it works best here, moving from Revenge of the Sith and then A New Hope to the Rogue One to A New Hope. It just works so well, and so I think Mike's right in that regard. And again, if you were looking to carve out pieces of Star Wars and pieces of really good Star Wars, just narrowing it down to that arc or that 3-movie type of snippet, if you were just to sit down and want to spend a day watching Star Wars, it's hard to argue that you could find a better stretch of Star Wars for 3 in a row with Revenge of the Sith and then Rogue One and A New Hope.
Right. All great films, too. Like, arguably some of the stronger ones in all of the movies that we've gotten so far. So are we saying that Solo, Star Wars story probably is just kind of one of the optional movies? I think we can argue that Rogue One makes sense here to kind of bridge those trilogies. But Solo feels like it is kind of that movie you watch at the very end, or it's an optional one kind of thing.
I think a lot of people believe it was optional in the first place. Is probably why it didn't do as well, and a lot of stuff, right, in that regard, which I think is a huge miss for people who are missing the point. But what I like about Solo's a Star Wars story is I think this is something that you can get when you get introduced, and we'll kind of talk about some of the other orders that let's table that until we get to like machete and some of the other kind of mixes and mashes of orders here. Because I think solo Star Wars works better in some other areas, but kind of worked in between.
Right. Okay. So here's the machete order, right? So this is episode 4, episode 5. So you go New Hope, Empire Strikes Back. Then you jump to Attack of the Clones. So you remove the Phantom Menace altogether. And then you go back to, after Attack of the Clones, you get a Revenge of the Sith. Then you jump back to Return of the Jedi. And again, this was never in the original one because this was done, created prior to the sequel trilogy. But then I just tacked on The Force Awakens, Last Jedi, Rise of Skywalker. That seems to be the prevailing viewing order for the updated machete order. So for me, this is a kind of I actually really enjoy this. I don't know that I could watch this in this order and truly appreciate what it's trying to do. But I think you said it really well earlier. It does kind of tell you just the meat and bones, everything you need to know. And as blasphemous as it sounds to remove the Phantom Menace, it actually has no bearing on any of this stuff, right? Outside of being able to just see that Anakin Skywalker was a pure, innocent child at one point, which I think you still get shades of that in Attack of the Clones, right? In some ways, at least in the early on, the very beginning here, and his relationship with Padme. You see the sweetness and the kind side of Anakin Skywalker there, but removing that movie doesn't really do a whole lot to the series, and that was the reason why. And the other cool thing it does is it almost gives you Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith as a flashback to that ultimate moment in The Empire Strikes Back where he says, I'm your father, right? Suddenly, now Attack of the Clones, Revenge of the Sith acts as a flashback for you to go back, kind of get the meat and bones of exactly how he fell from grace and without any of the fluff, really. And then you jump back to Return of the Jedi and you have a different perspective going into Return of the Jedi than you did because you've just watched the origins of Darth Vader. And it makes more sense logically now for why he would suddenly, you can see the softer side of him there. And it's not such a far stretch or of years, literally. I mean, it was literally years before we got to see, that story being told, the backstory there. But it's a shorter time span for you to wait to see him kind of come back to the light when you get to the end of Return of the Jedi.
Yeah, again, I think this isn't the order for me. I understand why people like it, though, especially if you're wanting to strip out a lot of the stuff. But to me, it's just this one really does go a little bit too much back and forth. But there's something I like about this, and I think this is where like Solo, a Star Wars story, has a place, right? You start to say, okay, if I'm willing to go back and forth, and again, this is more machete order for the Skywalkers, but if you want to work in the backstory for Han Solo, a similar scenario presents itself where you can say, okay, I'm going to take Solo Star Wars story. I'm going to put it in either after A New Hope or maybe even after Empire. But I think after A New Hope makes sense, right? Of, okay, we get introduced to this scoundrel Han Solo, kind of a heart of gold. Where does this guy come from? And unfortunately with this order, it's probably a little too soon to jump into that because there's no preamble to it. And I think it works better with like kind of in a chronological order. But that's where you can say, okay, if I'm going to go back in time and flash back to Anakin Skywalker, this is where I can flash back to a Han Solo as well in these early movies, or you could even push in, if you want to go ahead and get all of those out of the way, you can bring this back in after The Force Awakens, after Han Solo, of course, is killed. Then you can come back and learn the backstory of him and Chewie and what Chewie reacted the way he did and all that good stuff, right? So I think that's where Solo Star Wars story really starts to really come up as a viable option of being able to work it into these other orders. And the Machete order really allows you and kind of breaks that mold for you to where that's more acceptable. And you're already in that space and that frame of mind to be able to accept something like that. And I think if you put it more in the sequel trilogy era, especially after Force Awakens, you have the age of Han Solo in Force Awakens. And then so going back and seeing Alden Ehrenreich, be Han Solo in that character, you're a little more forgiving maybe than if you put this towards the original trilogy where Harrison Ford was much younger, right? So anyways, I like it probably more after Force Awakens in this area, but I think that's where this order really kind of helps.
That's interesting. You said that. I was thinking too, like, I like what you said, but then I started thinking, I wonder if you put Solo in this Machete order, if you put it before The Force Awakens, so you end with Return of the Jedi, you've gotten you've gotten 2 movies now. Is it 1, 2? No, technically 3 movies at this point with Han Solo and Chewbacca, all right? And then before you get into that big scary moment in The Force Awakens for Han Solo, you get the background. Rather than keep putting it out. I think you could put it in before or after The Force Awakens, but I do like that idea. I stuck it here at the very end because I think this is where most people said it's still kind of an optional movie. And then I forgot to include this in the last slide, but the Phantom Menace again is removed from here. And I stuck Rogue One at the top. I don't know where it fits honestly in this Machete Plus order. Again, this was done prior to the sequel trilogy, which means it was done prior to Rogue One and a solo Star Wars story. So I don't know if there's an official place for it. But I figured if the whole point of this is to kind of tell this really kind of concise story, I would even say it's probably still optional, but I stuck it at the very beginning anyway. So I don't know. What are your thoughts, I guess, on the order here?
I agree with you. Leading off everything with Rogue One is pretty tough, I think, because you're coming into Rogue One a little bit with a certain amount of understanding of where things are at.
Yeah.
Quite honestly, when you start thinking Rogue One, you're like, okay, I've almost got to put Andor in front of Rogue One to build up where we're at. So Rogue One makes more sense to get into the movies if you're going to lead off with it, right?
We're getting there. Hold on. But
no,
yes,
but you start to see what you need in order for Rogue One to be more successful. Rogue One was really successful because not only did it lead up to a story we knew really familiar and really well, but we understood Star Wars and we understood what was going on everywhere, right? And I think that's something that we lose sight of a little bit, whereas Andor in particular is helping us build up to that point almost in a fresh and new way, even though if you know Star Wars, it helps, but you don't have to. And so I think that's where, I think in this case, Rogue One becomes much more optional. And I would actually argue solo Star Wars stories is much more compelling and interesting in this order because you are going back and forth on the Skywalker line, even though you're kind of blurring that a little bit with the Han Solo story, in the middle of all of it.
Yep. Diamond Fix says the only way to truly start is with a holiday special, which I didn't include. I didn't include the Ewoks, Battle for Endor, Caravan of Courage. I could have done those and I didn't.
Because no one would finish what they started if we started with any of them.
They're not that bad. I have all those on VHS.
They are that bad. That's the problem.
They're gems, true gems in the Star Wars saga that no one speaks about. All of them. But okay, so all right. So then the last thing that we have really is kind of like this. It's a little crazy here. So this is what I'm calling what the heck did I call it? The narrative timeline. And so I really looked out, try to find somebody that had done this. And I think they had done this without some of the yellow content here. A lot of the Disney Plus content was not included. But and I don't recommend this for anybody. Like the amount of time that it would take to really get through all of this. And you can see because even the text is an eyesore, right, in terms of how small the text is. But I try to weave in the Tales of the Jedi stuff, put those in chronological order, then the movies. I've also included the Bad Batch, Kenobi. There's the Andor series like we talked about, Star Wars Rebels, which is my favorite. And then even like Mandalorian, the Book of Boba Fett. But I mean, if you wanted to say to somebody, if someone said, I just want to take it all in, and I've got weeks and weeks and weeks of time, because the Clone Wars alone, that'll take you, I don't even know what the time is. Someone did the math on it. I don't recall what it is, but it is like literally, 5-6 days of nonstop watching television just to get through. I think it's almost 6 days straight if you were to watch all of the Clone Wars, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, but again, we're not recommending this, but I mean, this seems like if you really wanted to tell the full story, and I think if you're listening to this podcast and no one made you do it, and you're a huge Star Wars fan, this is probably, you've already done all of this, right? So like we've done this probably naturally over time. I just don't know that I would recommend this to anybody at this point. It's just such a huge time sink. And it really kind of expands way more than the Skywalker saga. I mean, we're not even like Ahsoka's in here, right? The Bad Batch is in here. There's more on Andor than just a small role that he had in, Rogue One. But it really gets into a lot of the characters and a lot of the life that I feel like we really love, truly breathe. Ventress, my God, we didn't even talk about Ventress. She's never in any of the movies, and yet she's such a substantial character, much like Ahsoka, that she is core to the Star Wars saga or the Star Wars fandom in a lot of ways. But I guess when you see this, outside of wanting to probably vomit, how much would you ever recommend this to anybody? And like, who is that person?
Oh my gosh. I mean, there's a lot of argument within just what we have here, because when you look at The Mandalorian and Book of Boba Fett, you've almost got to split those into different seasons and which one slots where, and then maybe even episodes. And I think I made the comment to you when you sent this to me. It was with Clone Wars and the Clone Wars, movie, right, which was the stitched together. That's actually chronologically out of order from the Clone Wars series, and you've almost got to split that one up. But I think one thing it speaks to, before I answer your question, I think one thing it speaks to is that how daunting it is to get into Star Wars now.
Yeah,
This is what, when people go to Disney Plus and they pull up Star Wars, they see this. It doesn't have as much, it's not as cohesive as what you have with like a Marvel Cinematic Universe, right? Where you can say definitively, for the most part, and you could probably argue some things more recently are slipping a little bit out of this, but you have pretty much a path that you follow because they laid it out very intentionally. They weren't stepping on each other's toes. In this case, we've got a lot of things that have started to overlap and they happen at the same time. And so you have a little optionality, which is cool, and you can kind of focus a little more on what you want. But I think if you're the completionist, though, this is kind of your timeline. Yeah, I mean, yeah, like for you. But again, I probably would still, like when I look at things like Tales of the Jedi, I kind of probably lump those more in with Clone Wars, right? I probably don't break them all apart and try to do this chronologically about some of that. I probably still bucket them together. Now, the Qui-Gon and Dooku stuff might be the exception to that.
Yeah,
I might
cool.
I might pull those out and put those a little closer to Attack of the Clones. But again, you have some of that too, where you kind of bundle these things together. I love the idea of like Bad Batch going in there, not only as a sequel to Clone Wars, but right up into some of the movies as well. I think that's a fantastic way of watching. I think there's some really cool things to explore within all of this to be able to piece it together and get a really robust picture of it. But I think the one thing it'll probably end up showing you is that the Clone Wars era and the animation that we had, that era of TV with Rebels and all of that, I have a feeling it'd probably be everybody's favorite part of it too. Not only is it just a ton of content for like 11 or 12 years worth of content basically, but it's just really compelling. It's really great storytelling, and you get fantastic arcs that really feel like they're taking the story forward in many ways. But
yeah,
again, this is a great way to visualize it though for people. So great job doing this, by the way. This is really impressive.
I was up one night and thought, you know what, I'm going to do this. And like I said, there were things
So
that attempts had
Albert,
been done.
Albert, for your homework for tomorrow, I'm going to
Yeah.
expect this to with all the books now too and comics.
Well, and that's funny because in my show notes here, I was going to mention that this doesn't even account for everything. This is still not the entire universe. Like you said, there's so many books. There are so many comic books. There are the High Republic. We didn't even touch that. I mean, that sits in, even before all of this stuff here, right? So there's still more Star Wars. This isn't the definitive be all end all.
Oh, true. Yeah, you
what's out
don't have
there.
Acolyte in here or anything like
Nope.
that either.
Nope. Yeah, and we should mention too, like I do have Star Wars Resistance. So for the two people that love that much as I did, it doesn't include, of course, Skeleton Crew, right? The Book of Boba Fett, or maybe Part 2, Mandalorian season 4 is probably going to be in here at some point. So it just continues to expand. But you made a good point. Like because Star Wars has been now around for 40 plus years. We don't have the privilege of like the Marvel universe, and so people have gone back and forth and told these different stories, and we've really loved that storytelling, right? A lot of people, and some people have said, I don't need to know everything. I don't need to know how the soup has been made. But for those of us that are completionists or just want the lore or enjoy the lore, they've been very good to us, I think, in that regard. And it feels like there is still even more coming out. So at some point, I mentioned that we probably will know the race of Yoda, at some point down the road. Maybe it's 10 years from now, maybe it's 50 years from now. But there's no end in sight in terms of what's going to come. And there could still very well be things that are going to be plugged into this era, even though this does feel like it's very, very saturated. I think the new movies, of course, that they've announced are going to take us into some different spaces, which is nice and refreshing in a lot of ways. So we'll have to see where all this kind of plays out and where it fills in.
Okay, Albert. So let's take this back because we've only got a few minutes left here.
Yeah.
So I'm going to give you have two things. So one, what is your definitive watching order for most people, you think? And then what is your definitive watch order if you have to guarantee you have to have Rogue One and Solo a Star Wars story in it? So where every movie that's been released, and again, I'm taking the Clone Wars theatrical movie, and I'm using finger quotes for those listening because I know it was released at theaters, but it's not a movie. And so just of these 11 movies. So even if you keep it to 9, what's your official? Is it still the way that they came out, the theatrical release? And if you work in the other 2 movies, what order is the one that you're most likely to recommend to people?
Well, so for me personally, I'm, like I said at the very beginning, it is the original theatrical release, with the exception of, I don't know that I would recommend watching, Rogue One all the way at the end. I would still move that in right after Revenge of the Sith and before A New Hope. And Solo: A Star Wars Story, I was sticking at the bottom, but I like what you'd said earlier, like sticking that after The Force Awakens or even just before The Force Awakens, I think is how I would personally watch the movies. I think the recommendation, and again, this is to bring it back to Riley if she's still even here. I had asked her to watch it 1 through 8, simply because I think narratively that's probably the easiest way to consume Star Wars, especially for someone who doesn't have the benefit of all of the other stuff, or has, there are people out there that have watched these movies once, maybe twice, but they're not diehard Star Wars fans. And if they were coming back to it, this would probably still be the easiest way to kind of consume it and get refreshed and kind of understand everything that's happening without really doing a deep dive. I think that chronological order of 1 through 9 probably still makes sense. I would probably still, even with that, stick Rogue One. I think for Riley, I told her to watch Rogue One in between Revenge of the Sith and A New Hope. And then Solo Star Wars Story, I didn't even recommend that one yet, but I wanted to get through all the other ones and then stick to that one kind of at the probably the very end. I think that makes the most sense. So that's my short answer. But like you said at the very beginning, it just really depends on what you're trying to do. What do you want to get out of Star Wars? How much do you want to get into the weeds, the proverbial weeds, and the depth that Star Wars has to offer? Not every person's the same. Attention spans aren't the same. The time is so precious for a lot of people that, there's a couple different recommendations you can make depending on, what their needs are.
Yeah, and I'm inclined to do something similar. So I think my default answer will still be 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 7, 8, 9. And if I have to work, if people are like, I'm adamant about getting, and so for those I'd recommend Rogue One and Solo are kind of optional. If you want to stick to just the core movies, those are your 9. The other 2 are optional. Now, if you want, force me to work those into that one, I'm probably more inclined. I think I'll put Solo after Force Awakens. And I think with Rogue One, I'll probably put it after Return of the Jedi, or maybe even after Revenge of the Sith, to be honest with you. I don't know that I would lead into it before A New Hope. And so I think probably after Return of the Jedi, it's like, okay, we've completed the original trilogy. If you want to see kind of how this thing got started, now you have this movie, and then you can get into the prequels, and then you can get into the sequels along with Solo, and you kind of do a flashback there. If people are really adamant about working those in and they really need them, then I think that the chronological, the George Lucas order really makes probably the most sense. 1, 2, 3, Rogue One, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then again, I think I put Solo Star Wars Story after Force Awakens. I think it just works really well there. Again, Harrison's age, I think is a big part of kind of my thinking that one.
Yeah.
And then you finish it up with 8 and 9. And so I think if you force me to put those into it, the 1 through 9 method works the best with those slotted in those positions.
I like that. Yeah, again, no right or wrong answer here, really. As long as you watch them, I'm just glad people want to watch these and they come to us, for advice and help.
It's crazy, man. 46 years later, we're still having debates about what the right way to consume Star Wars, or we're still talking about getting people into Star Wars. So, as far as I'm concerned, that's an really exciting proposition and a fun challenge to have too about getting more information from the person that's asking you why this is important to them, and understanding them a little bit better. To me, it's that journey. It's not always like just sitting down and doing something. It's kind of like when you go out with your friends, it's not necessarily that you're going to go and have a drink. You need to have a drink. No, you're there for the conversation. You're there for the atmosphere. You're here for all of the things that go with it, not necessarily just the thing that you're there doing physically, right?
Yeah.
And so that's how I treat these type of things with Star Wars. I think that's just more exciting about it. That's the thing that brings me joy these days, because I've seen them 1,000 times. So now it's helping other people in their own journey is a lot more rewarding for me as well. And that's probably age, coming into some of that too. But
Wisdom.
That's the part that I find that's fun.
Yeah, no, for sure. The other thing when you were talking here, one thing that just kind of came into mind, and maybe we can end on this topic here, but again, going back to the new movies that were announced. So we're looking at potentially New Jedi Order, although now they're saying officially that's not going to be the name of it. That's fine, whatever it is. That Rey's story that's going to take place after the Rise of Skywalker. Then you've got Dawn of the Jedi. And of course, we've got what we're calling the Heir to the Empire story, whatever that is, right. The Dave Filoni movie. The relevance of the Skywalker saga does seem like it's probably going to fade over time, at least with these new movies. I'm not saying permanently, right? But it feels like with the the New Jedi Order, that feels like it's probably going to be more focused on Rey and, rebuilding, of course, right? How much of the Skywalker saga plays into that? I think there'll be some direct lines and throwback call back to some of the stuff that Luke said, or maybe some of the lessons that Yoda went through. I would expect even there to be some kind of ties even to the High Republic, right? Getting into the specifics of the hubris of the Jedi and how they fell and that sort of thing, how Palpatine came to power. But I do feel like that is kind of going to be its kind of own standalone thing. When Dawn of the Jedi comes out, I don't understand how any of this would tie back. Maybe it ties back to Mortis. Maybe it ties back to dyads in some way. But again, that does feel like its own. And then the relevance of this, Dave Filoni movie, that seems to be primarily going to be focused on the Disney Plus stuff, right? All of the Mandalorians and Book of Boba Fett's and the Ahsoka and Skeleton Crew. That seems to be the birthplace for where we're going to find a lot of that relevance. And you could argue the Thrawn stuff as well, but maybe there's a tie back to Rebels there in some way, maybe the books itself. But again, going back to the Skywalker saga, not really a whole lot there. So it does feel like over time, maybe they're not going to be as relevant. They are kind of going to be their own standalone thing. So I don't know. Do you see that? Do you feel the same way?
Yeah, I think it's cool. I mean, I kind of said it before. I mean, when you look at the Clone Wars era with Rebels included in that, I mean, that's a chunk of an era on its own that people absolutely love, and that's their part of Star Wars. And now I think that we're building out other groupings of content. Makes a lot of sense. And I think Mandalorian, Book of Boba Fett, what will culminate New Jedi Order and those types of things. I think all of that makes sense for them to, or not New Jedi Order, but the the New Republic. All make sense. They all make sense in that regard. And we know for a long time they've been wanting to build a new series of content, right? A new story arc, universe line, whatever. And we thought that for a long time that was going to be, when we have High Republic, which is kind of doing it, but still not made the official jump to a true TV show or movie aside from the shorts that we get on for the Disney Junior type stuff.
Yeah.
But maybe Dawn of the Jedi is the beginning of something like that, right? And Old Republic and those types of things really start to come out and give you a bucket of content that you really grab onto. Like, that's my Star Wars. That's the Star Wars I like. You can go back to the beginning. You can do all of this stuff, all of the original Skywalker saga movies. But to me, I like that we're getting groupings of these other content that really define eras and define storytelling within a certain amount of time, but also have a very compact and a very, it just all works within it. You have the same characters. You have the flowing arcs between it. It's this MCU type of way of doing things. I think it defines our era, I think, in the last 10, 15 years of movie making in this genre. And so I think to have that in that totality and have that really focused for Star Wars, I think is a really great thing. And while it's daunting to look at Star Wars, you can come back and say, well, I really saw these Mandalorians once. They were really cool. All right, I've got a lot of great stuff for you to start with. Mm-hmm. Right, let's start with this Mandalorian stuff first, and then if you want to learn some backstory, here's some Clone Wars and some Rebels to sprinkle in there with it, right? And you start to be able to define that really clearly for people, and I think that's really neat.
Yeah, good points. All right, well, thanks to everybody that was in the live chat tonight, and especially for chiming in on your thoughts and opinions on the different orders that we came up, and certainly for providing your opinions on how to view them. I think I threw most of them up there. I just want to throw Rob's up here. He said Rogue One 456 123 Solo 789. So similar to what we were kind of talking about there. He said Rogue One is just the beginning of 6.
Yeah, he meant to say 4 on that one. Yeah,
it's for beginning of 4, but we get it. But hey, we had a lot of people out in the chat. How about some quick?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, again, if you're listening to this, cantinacast.com/YouTube, subscribe to the channel. We'd love to have you join us in chat. Tonight we had Jonathan Music Train, JJ Skywalker, Skywalker's Academy, Riley, Steph, Risk, Rob, Keaton, Jorge, Diamond Figs, Gary. If I missed anyone, my sincerest apologies, not intentional. If you are lurking in the background, we'd love for you to come out and give us a hello and a wave in the chat. Join everybody else. Everyone loves to greet each other and interact with one another in the chat as well. We try to throw things up on the screen. So certainly please do invite you to come out and join us, usually Sunday nights and Thursday nights. And we would love to have you join us.
Yep. And if you're staying on with us, we're going to come back here in about, a minute into our Tatooine trading post, where we'll talk about the stuff that we've bought and collected here over the last week. And then, of course, we'll be back on Sunday for the Way Station, which is our wrap-up of news for Star Wars news for this week here, as well as our Patreon spotlight. So any final comments before we get out of here?
Nope. Thank you, everyone.
All right. We'll see you guys here in just a bit.
You're still listening? Wow, that's amazing. Well, I'm here to give you the disclaimer. Normally we do a big, long, drawn-out disclaimer thing saying what's what and who's what and all that other stuff, but I think you guys kind of know that Lucasfilm and Disney have no affiliation with us at all, and we have none with them. We talk about Star Wars, which is their property and all that other good, fun stuff, but I think you can tell which is our stuff and which is their stuff. If you can't, well, then send a lawyer to send an email to me, and I'll be glad to chat with them. Other than that, you know what's what, so that's your disclaimer.